noticed that they had to go into the city to get toads to bring to the suburbs.
You are listening to Urban Wildlife Podcast.
So welcome back to another episode of the Urban Wildlife Podcast. We've got one of your hosts, me, Billy Brown. We've got other hosts,
Tony Crosdale.
and we have our guest host,
Tobias Landberg.
Tobias. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you?
I am a professor of biology at Arcadia University in Glenside, just north of Philadelphia. And I study reptiles and amphibians primarily. I dabble in insects and other things as the mood takes me. My training is in functional morphology, which is how animals do the things that they do, locomotion and respiration, that sort of thing. But I also get into evolutionary ecology, and so the ways that organisms' environments affect their life history strategies and the way that environmental change affects the expression of morphology and what animals can do.
Cool. I'll start with some of our usual reminders. If you like the podcast, and if you're listening to it and it isn't your first time, you probably like it. So go on iTunes, Stitcher, whatever your hosting platform, and please rate us positively. Leave us any comments you want, because we take that stuff seriously. Please tell everyone you know about the podcast so that they'll listen to it and love it also. If you want to tweet us at UrbWildlifeCast. You can email us at urbanwildlifecast@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook. All great ways to connect. And if you want to contribute to the show, you can email us or tweet at us and tell us what you want to talk about. Or you could just record something short, especially if it's an observation of some kind of urban wildlife. And we include plants in that. So if you're seeing some neat wildflower growing out of your sidewalk crack in, Cairo, or if you're looking at pigeons wherever they are in the world, because they're everywhere, or civets in Singapore, or cockatoos in
Cans.
or raccoon dogs in Tokyo, record a little bit on your phone and send us the file. We'll call it some
Wildlife bling?
and we'll get it on the show. We're going to start with listening to an interview I did with sort of the director of a university nature reserve in Mexico City. Full disclosure, I have a bias towards Mexico City. I love the city. I think it's one of the great cities in the world and doesn't get enough respect from Americans. And I was looking around and I found this sort of nature reserve in the middle of Mexico City, which for context, we're talking about Mexico City with a population of somewhere between 18 and 20 million people. It's a huge city. And the UNAM, the sort of national university, is enormous. Total enrollment, something like 500,000 on multiple campuses. The main campus in Mexico City has a population, if you include employees and stuff, of about 250,000. Sorry, you just made an oh my lord face. So when they call it the Ciudad Universitaria, like the university city, it's really like a city in the middle of a huge city. Yeah, we will hear about a couple species of smaller mammals. And this whole conversation ended up segueing into a discussion of axolotls. And then he also talks in the discussion about a suburb, what is now a neighborhood in Mexico City called Xochimilco. And Xochimilco includes some of the lake that used to be most of Mexico City. Mexico City is in this basin in the mountains. Used to be mostly a lake and was the Aztec capital. And so once upon a time being 600 years ago or so, that whole lake would have been axolotl habitat. And so over time, that's shrunk till it's basically just this neighborhood of Xochimilco. And then even within there, as he talks about, they're under assault from introduced fish.
Okay. Well, I am Luis Zambrano. I am a professor in the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM. I am working at the Institute of Biology in the same university, and also I am in charge of the reserve of the ecological reserve of the university.
So could you please describe the reserve?
Okay. Well, the campus is huge. It's about, the general campus, and I will talk about the reserve within the campus. The campus is about 730 something hectares of longitude. So it's a huge campus. 1/3 of that, 237, is the reserve of the well, it's called stone. In the direct translation is the stone reserve of the ecological stone reserve within the campus, which is a lot. Comparatively with other places around the city, which by far, or natural areas, are by far smaller, particularly in the places that it's already urbanized. So the campus is in the south of the city, closer to places that are already not urbanized, such as Ajusco Hill and Xochimilco. So it's funny, but it's one of the biggest places in terms of natural areas, but also is connected with the huge biomass of woods in the south of the city, that is outside of the urbanized areas.
Great. And so how did it end up getting protected as a reserve?
Okay, that's a long story, actually. The campus started in 1951, 1952. Normally, the university was in the city center. And in some moment, the government decided to send the universities really, really far away from the city center, part for political reasons, in part, but also because the university needed a lot of more space. So they founded with these 700 and something hectares the university here, and we started with the central area, which is now also this area is protected by UNESCO as a World Heritage because it's very nice. It's the stadium and the main building and the library, which is with a lot of very nice murals from different important muralists such as Diego Rivera and O'Gorman. So this area, we started with this area in the first 20 years, and afterwards the university started to grow to different regions within this area. In some moment, about 35 years ago, in the 80s, at the beginning of the 80s, some local governors wanted to make a lot of buildings just within the university, just in front of the science school. And some of the science school students made a lot of research in terms of biology and ecosystem services. Well, not called ecosystem services in that moment, but about ecosystem services, how much water was infiltrating and those type of things. And when they saw that, they made a huge protest. The negotiations were harsh, but really interesting because we are in the university and the people hear each other. Although sometimes there are some radicals from one side and radicals from the other, but we normally try to hear each other.
Good.
It doesn't matter of the ideology or the ideas you have. And then the authorities of the university in the beginning of the 80s, with these students, decided to generate a protected area because they understood that this area is highly important. So from the 1982-1983, we have this reserve. At the beginning was really small, was 150 hectares. But different conflicts, such as this one, appeared along the years, and those had helped a lot the reserve because it has grown from this conflict.
I started looking at your list of research projects, and it struck me how that there are some benefits for having a place to do research inside of the university. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of research that goes on within the reserve?
Oh, yeah. We have a lot of a really variety of research. Some of them, I mean, most of them obviously are ecological or biologicals. I will go deeper in that because I am a biologist, so I can go a little bit more in that direction. But I also wanted to mention that also architecture is also, the School of Architecture is highly interested in the reserve, particularly in landscape or urban careers or schools, that they also wanted to make research here and wanted to understand how it's working, this research. So there is not only for biologists or ecologists, there are also engineers to try to understand the water infiltration. So we have a lot of type of research from different type of schools, but obviously the most number of these research is basically in ecological research. One of the interesting things about, for example, of the researches they are doing are, well, first how many plants and which type of species we have here.
Sure.
Also, how many insects. I mean, we haven't understood how many insects we have here, which type of species we have. Sometimes appear new species, not new species in terms of taxonomically, but new species from the reserve, for the reserve. The second one is how the heterogeneity of the reserve. I mean, although it's 237 hectares within the same place, basically, it's not the same the north than the south. It's a little bit higher, for example, the south, and that generates a different type of ecosystem. So different type of plants can survive in one place, and different type of animals can survive in the other place.
Sure.
So other type of research are going in the direction of in which place which type of animals can survive, and in which place which type of plants. Those are, genetic variability, also reproduction, the interaction between plant and animals, for example, pollination and coevolution have been researches that have been done in the reserve. But also other type of interesting research, such as restoration.
Sure.
We have 2 or 3 huge problems in terms of introduced species and local extinctions, and we are trying now to generate, for example, eradication of 2 plants that are really, really bad. One of those is the eucalyptus. The second one, I don't know the name in English, but it's a grass.
Okay.
And for animals, we have huge problems with dogs and cats, basically. No?
Okay.
So we are generating researches to how deal with these problems, reducing the amount of these organisms in the best way to avoid any imbalance in the ecosystem for one side, but also to avoid massacres that are not necessarily sometimes. No.
Do you have any particular studies that stand out to you as something as one of your favorites?
Well, yeah, I have. I think 3 studies that are really, really nice from my point of view. One of those is not mine at all. I mean, it's a geek that is very, very interesting person that he's with 2 or 3 students, PhD students. He's trying to understand this heterogeneity within the reserve. So he's generating models, mathematical models to generate occupancy areas of different type of species.
Okay.
So we are now understanding, particularly with birds, it's basically with birds and plants. So we are now understanding how and why the reserve is so heterogeneous, the heterogeneity of the reserve, and the behavioral relation between birds is changing a lot in different areas. So those type of things struck me, and this is a very nice research.
Okay.
The other 2 are, one is I am not directly related, but I like because I normally work with restoration. The other is very nice and very attractive because it's about the reintroduction of the gray fox.
Oh.
When I was a student, there were foxes here in the reserve and in the campus, and suddenly the numbers were down. and we are trying to figure out why. My hypothesis is the feral dogs that displace them in some way. But we are generating, well, first, why they left or why they disappear, and some of the studies have been done in terms of which praise they have, if they are ill, etc., etc. So the food web of this.
Sure.
And the other is how the feral dogs behave in order to see if and how we can extract them to reduce a risk for a potential reintroduction of the fox. And the last one is the one that I am really involved, which is not exactly from animals of the reserve, but it's animals from Mexico City, which is the axolotl. I work basically in Xochimilco, which is a wetland area in the south part of Mexico City. And the most important animal there, and basically from my point of view in the central Mexico, is the axolotl, which is this salamander, a neotenic salamander that used to live here in the whole Mexican Valley until 50s, I suppose, and the 50s have been decreased a lot, the population. So now the last remnant of distribution is Xochimilco, which is very small and is highly perturbed and really threatened by urbanization. So now we are working in a very small place of the reserve. Is a highly managed place. It's about 16 hectares of highly managed place that we are trying to restore in general terms, but because it was a pit for minery, they arrived to the phreatic area, and then the 4 lakes were created in this area, which is highly interesting. These salamanders also were highly important in Mexico culture because, were as important for pre-Columbian cultures that they were considered as the twin god of the most important god of the Aztecs, which the name was Quetzalcoatl, the most important god. And the twin god, the ugly twin god, was the xolotl, which is the axolotl, basically. So it is culturally is highly important for Mexico, this animal. And also, well, until very few years, local people used to eat them when they were abundant, used to eat them because it was a very, very good food for a nutritional, has a lot of good nutritional elements. And also, finally, it's used for traditional medicine a lot. So the axolotl, as you can see, is very, very interesting. But it's going to the extinction in the wild. Is directly going to extinction if we don't do anything. Do something. I am working 12 years of my life working in the restoration of Xochimilco to avoid this extinction, but the speed of the reduction of the population is still going in the opposite direction, and I would like to. So basically, one of the safeguards or a safe place to generate a new population that could survive in a semi-environmental similar, I mean, an environment similar to these areas is in the reserve.
So you were saying that you have a pit left over from mining, and so what we might call that is like in English a quarry. So like a hole in the ground that gets filled up with groundwater. Am I understanding correctly?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
So it's not natural because these lakes are not natural because we need the pit to that sometimes appear, but also they are not artificial, but because nobody wants them there. So somebody appear because of the human, activities. So we have 4 lakes within the reserve that we can use. I mean, they are new, so it's not like you are disturbing the local animals
ecosystem.
Plants. Yeah, exactly, because they are completely new. It's semi-artificial. So it's a nice opportunity to generate a huge lab for a very good experiment. So how to restore these areas, which are quite similar to Xochimilco. and have very regulated all the environment characteristics in order to reintroduce axolotls there to buy a little bit of time in order to restore Xochimilco and then reintroduce them there.
Okay, how's it going? Have you managed to get them breeding in the lakes inside the reserve?
No, basically we are in the first steps. We started about half of a year ago. We first introduced some axolotls within cages in order to see if they were feeding already or not. They fed some things, but in some places, particularly, they were thinner and thinner. So we have to put them out in order to check it out what is going on. The other places, they are full of carp and tilapia, which is one of the threats of the axolotls, basically, the introduced fish. So we are also working in extracting all those carp and tilapia that somebody, when they saw lakes, I don't know if it happens in US, but in Mexico...
All the time, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, they see lake and they put fish, so they don't care if they are from Japan or from Africa or they introduce fish. So we are trying to reduce or eliminate this carp and tilapia. And at the same time, we are evaluating how they develop within these cages. Okay. My idea is that by June, July of this year, of this new year, 2016, we can liberate some of them with radio tags in order to follow them along the lakes for 3 or 4 days in order to check it out, which are the best places for them, and then try to reproduce places in that direction.
So we have these reserves that are surrounded by very urban areas. Do you see, we talked a little bit about feral animals and introduced plants. Do you see, or what happens, I guess, when animals from the reserve, or plants, I guess, but I think of things wandering, it's more animals. But what happens with animals leaving the reserve and ending up in the more urban areas surrounding it?
Oh, yeah, we have a lot of those, actually, particularly possums. Yeah, tlacuaches is in Spanish, basically, and it is also a very important animal for the Mexican culture. Possums are ones that they like to leave the reserve. Sometimes, I mean, they don't recognize borders, so sometimes you see them in different places. And it's funny because sometimes we receive calls from people in the middle of the city that says, I have a possum or I have a cacomistle. I don't know the scientific name of the cacomistle, but it's like it's the mix between a raccoon and a lemur.
So we call it, in English, you usually call it a ring-tailed cat.
Okay.
Even though it's not a cat, but yeah, ring-tailed. Yep.
Okay, the ring-tailed cat. Well, we call it cacomistle, which is by far more difficult to pronounce. We found people that they get them in the middle of the city. So these guys leave the natural areas, and in some moments they try to recover their first places that they used to live in the middle of the city. So we see them in the roofs of the houses or in between walls. We try to rescue them, and our problem is that we used to liberate them here in the reserve, but now we have a lot of possums. So we need to find the way that...
But the possums aren't living... So in the United States, possums are routinely urban animals that live only in people's houses or in trees and under their porches. So are they just living their whole lives out in the city, or are they moving between the two spaces?
I think that some of them, the ones that we found around the reserve, because we find a lot of them around the reserve. They live in the reserve and then live out. And the ones that live in the middle of the city, then I suppose that they were born there. Okay. Nobody saw them because also we are urban people and the people doesn't see nature at
all. And is it similar with I'm going to try to say it, the cacomisles?
That is good. Yeah.
Thank you. Do they live in the long sort of all the time outside of in urban areas, or are they mainly traveling between the reserve or wooded areas and urban areas?
I think that I see them I see them mostly in wooded areas and in the reserve.
Okay.
Mostly are there. Sometimes they call us and say, actually, in 26th of December, just before Christmas, a friend of mine called me to say, okay, we captured a cacomistle. So please come from it to pick him up.
Yeah.
So we have to pick him up, but because he used to live in the roof, and he made a lot of noises. That's the reason they didn't like him. But I think that is also urban. But most of them live in the reserve and in the wooded areas.
So when I talked to you last time, I said we were going to do an experiment on axolotls.
Yeah.
We did it. There was a thesis. We wrote it up, submitted it, and I got the reviews yesterday.
Wow.
And they were like really great reviews.
Okay. Good.
So it's basically accepted with minor revisions.
Congratulations.
Right?
Right on.
That's what I'm talking about. We were trying to understand their maternal investment. So when salamanders and when lots of organisms, reproduce, the first nutrients that the offspring are going to be living off of is whatever their mother gives them. And then that's pretty much it. So for something like a salamander, the axolotl, the female will lay her eggs, and she has a choice. She can either take the amount of nutrients that she has and divide it up into lots of little packages, or she can make a lot of offspring, but each one doesn't get very many calories. Or she can make bigger packages, fewer offspring, and then the offspring have more resources to make it into the world. And it depends on a lot of factors, how much, how many calories, how much yolk she can put into each egg. And so I developed a technique in grad school to what we call allometrically engineer or manipulate the amount of yolk in an embryo
Suck it out.
by doing a surgery on the embryo under a microscope before they have even a nervous system developed, so they can't feel anything. And I make a little needle, go under the scope, suck out a little bit of the yolk, and then we have a control, and we can compare the effect of having more yolk or less yolk in an offspring. And I've done this for a lot of different ambistomatid salamanders, which is the family of salamanders that axolotls are in. Salamanders that might be familiar to people are like the spotted salamander, the tiger salamander. Those are all in the same family. And I've done 4 species of salamanders before the axolotl. And they all had various types of effects on early life history traits. So
Not consistent among across the family?
different effects in different species.
Okay.
Different levels of response.
Okay.
So some species hatched out early because they monitor apparently how much yolk they have. And when they start running low, then they got to hatch out and they got to go find their own food. They turn out smaller. No surprise, they have less resources. They actually monitor that and they grow smaller bodies. Survival can be affected, viability, various things like that. And the way it was looking was that the animals that had really big eggs had really big effects when I took out yolk. And the animals that had really small eggs had very low effects. Which was the opposite of what I predicted. Because I thought the ones with small eggs were just going to do terribly when I took out, a little bit of yolk because they're so close to that bottom threshold.
Yeah.
But what it turns out is there's this coevolution where the ones that have big yolky bellies and big eggs, they've evolved to rely on those nutrients. And so when you take it away, they're kind of spoiled. They tank. They do terribly. The ones that have really small eggs, they apparently don't expect a lot. And they show very low amounts of response.
Okay.
And to our great surprise, when we took out 20% of the yolk reserves from axolotls, nothing happened.
So they're the small egg variety?
All ambystomatids have relatively chunky eggs compared to other amphibians. But within the family, they have moderate to smallish eggs. The ones that we were getting from the lab. So these are raised in a scientific lab.
How do you get so talk about, I guess, axolotls as I don't know what the right word is a model organism or
yeah.
Like,
well,
it's just order them up from a.
It's a really interesting story. It was at least 150 years ago. They imported some axolotls to France because it was a really interesting species. They have crazy life history where they don't undergo metamorphosis in the traditional sense of a salamander having a larva and then metamorphosing from the water and going onto land. Instead, they remain aquatic and they look like giant tadpoles for their entire life. They reproductively mature and then they stay in the water.
Yeah.
And so that was really interesting, and it raises a lot of big questions about evolution, the mechanisms. And now the axolotls are studied for limb generation, primarily, a lot of genetic works. It's essentially a species that now exists almost nowhere else.
And I looking it up, I easily found hobbyist axolotl information where they breed them to be different color morphs and kind of thing.
They have put strains that are true breeding GFP, green fluorescent protein, which is a protein that has been taken from jellyfish, actually. And they glow bright green, and they breed that true. And there's albino ones, and we were working on the quote unquote wild type, which may or may not be what wild animals look like at this point. It's a little hard to know. Somewhere
there has to be some kind of nightclub which has a black light and a tank of fluorescent axolotls. I'm sure there's like fluorescent zebrafish too.
You can buy fluorescent GFP expressing and other fluorescent protein expressing fish right down at your local PetSmart or Petco.
Wow. I remember when I was a kid I had neon tetras, and so this takes the neon concept to a whole different...
Oh, yeah. You turn out the light and still see
literally, they glow.
Yeah, it's very cool.
Like vanilla ice.
Like vanilla, exactly.
Yeah.
I don't know how to think of that. It's...
The axolotls are the ones that we get from the lab. They're only for science, so they're not for the pet trade.
Wait a second.
What?
You know about the jellyfish tank you can order from the internet?
What?
You can just order it. There's like a YouTube video, and you can order this jellyfish, like for your desk, whatever.
Is it actual jellyfish?
Yeah.
Okay.
And there's a whole thing, but Vanilla Ice was on the commercial for it.
Sometimes
next guest host, Vanilla Ice.
Will he bring Flavor Flav with him?
I know. Yeah, they're on the show together, right?
Yeah. So the next one was on recommendation of a professor at Hofstra named Russell Burke. But
name's familiar.
He studies... I was talking to him about two topics we're going to include in later episodes. So he was recommending some other people to talk to, including our next interviewee out in California about pond turtles, western pond turtles, and sort of, among other things, the effects of urbanization and how to deal with urbanization on them.
Right. So they get lonely. They don't... Because they moved out of their parents' house, and they kind of like, they're living in a place that's kind of new. They don't really, they're around lots of others, but they don't really connect.
Southern California is like that.
My name's Philip Spinks. I'm a staff research associate at the University of California, Los Angeles in Brad Schaefer's lab. Western pond turtle is the only native freshwater turtle species in California. That's actually not quite correct since we just split it into two species. So what used to be the western pond turtle is now composed of two distinct lineages or species, one being the northwestern pond turtle, which ranges from about the southern San Joaquin Valley north to Washington State through Oregon. And then the southern population of the western pond turtle ranges from along the Central Coast ranges in Central California down south through Southern California and into Baja California, northern portion of Baja California. So it's kind of a misnomer, the pond turtle. They live in ponds, of course, but you can find them in streams, slow-moving streams, fast-moving streams, lakes, rivers, little oxbows of rivers, the quiet parts of bigger rivers, that's where you'll find them. So they're very habitat generalists. You can find them in stock ponds, they're ponds that are purposely created to water cattle and agriculture. You can find them in not drainage ditches, but the canals that supply the agricultural fields here in California. And you find them in just a variety of habitat. In urban settings, you find them in city park, the ponds and lakes in city parks.
How are they doing generally, and how are they doing differently in urban settings?
Right. So in general, it depends on which part of the population you're talking about. The northern species, we call that Emys marmorata. That one's doing actually pretty well. There's a lot of native or undisturbed habitat in Northern California and Oregon, and they're doing pretty well. Even in urban spots, they do pretty well. In the southern part of the range, it's not clear. We don't think they're doing as well, mainly because there's not as much habitat. And what habitat there is heavily impacted by human populations. Mainly, if there's a pond and then a year later there's a Walmart on top of that pond, then obviously you won't have any pond turtles there anymore. And urban encroachment is probably the worst problem facing the southern population of the species, or the southern species. Sorry.
Like I live outside of the range of the red-eared slider, but they're still everywhere. How do they handle sort of mixes of exotic turtles in urban settings?
Yeah, that's an important question. It's one we don't have a good grip on. So we know that the red-eared slider, that's Trachomys stripta elegans, is one of the most invasive species on Earth. I think it's in the top 25 of most invasive animals. And it's a very good turtle. It's just able to live pretty much anywhere. It's very adaptable. It's very hardy. It's just a really good turtle. It does really good at being a turtle. And you find them all over the world, and especially in California. If you go to an urban lake, chances are you'll see a slider and not a western pond turtle. And part of that is because they're a little more noticeable. They have that big red slash on the side of their ear. That's why they're obviously why they call the red-eared slider. And they're not they don't seem to be as timid as our pond turtle. Our pond turtle is very timid. Most of the time you won't see them because they hear you or see you approaching, and they just kind of plop off into the water. You might hear a little plop, see a little ripple, but that's pretty much it. Unless you're real careful and you're stealthy or you have some binoculars, a lot of times you won't even see them, even if they are there. But you will see the slider because they're not as they typically tend to be not as skittish, and again because of the red, they're much easier for people to see. It's really hard to put your finger on that and say definitively, yes, they are negatively impacting our native pond turtles. My guess is that they are, but again, I can't come out and just show a study where it says absolutely this is clear-cut evidence that they do. Although I think it's pretty clear that they do, just because they take up space, they eat food, and they also. It's been reported there's been diseases brought in by red-eared sliders. Because a lot of times what happens is people have them as pets, and they keep them. The red-eared slider is a real aggressive kind of a bitey turtle. And you get them when you're small. They're small. They're just absolutely gorgeous turtles. And you have them for a while, and they get big, and they get stinky, and they get bitey, and they'll bite you if they get a chance. And so people just take them outside and literally dump them in the nearest creek or pond because they don't want to kill it, you know. And because they're brought from these, a lot of times, unsanitary conditions, they bring diseases with them. So this was actually shown in Washington State, where they have a couple populations there. They're fairly decent, but they were getting hammered by this. I believe it was a upper respiratory tract infection that was pretty clear was brought in by non-native sliders. So there's definitely some negative impacts. We just don't know the breadth of it, the scope of it.
Are there any cities where they're doing well or easy to spot, or is it just sort of you go to a waterway in Los Angeles or San Francisco and Portland, you'll probably see them?
Yeah, there's some in Golden Gate Park. They're working there to increase the native population there. They're going to be doing I believe they're going to be doing a Head Start program there, releasing native pond turtles there at I think it might be the Golden Gate Park, if I remember right. And you can see a lot of them at the UC Davis Arboretum waterway. It's a nice large waterway that we worked at for many years to monitor the pond turtle population there, and they're quite healthy there. There's quite a few there. And most places you can probably probably always a few natives, but again they're real hard to see, real stealthy, real skittish. And if you don't really know how to look for them, you probably won't see them.
Can you describe the Head Starting program real quick, just for people who aren't familiar with that kind of thing?
Right. Yeah. So Head Starting is one of the biggest problems with that native populations of turtles face is that the young hatchlings, or obviously they're young, the hatchlings are tiny. They're about the size of a quarter, and they're basically food for anything. Bullfrogs, unfortunately, bullfrogs are a real problem for hatchling turtles, and bass and predatory birds, anything that can eat it.
Point out that the first two items you just mentioned are also non-native invasives, right?
Yes, that's a very good point. Right. Yes, and bullfrogs are just a horrible problem. Crayfish eat youngs. Even diving beetles can take out hatchlings. So hatchlings are extremely vulnerable. But when a turtle gets older and gets to be about full size, then they're pretty bulletproof. I mean, except for yahoos that go out and shoot them, which does happen. They're pretty tough. There's not too many things that'll take them out. And so what happens is if you have an area where there's a lot of bullfrogs or a lot of crayfish or other urban predators like raccoons and stuff, you can grow them up in captivity to a certain size and then let them go out in the wild. When they get to that certain size, they're a lot less vulnerable to predators. There's a lot of controversy about the Head Starting programs, though, even in the turtle community. There's quite a few people that say it's pointless because unless you get rid of the problems at that habitat, why add turtles to it? If you have a pond that's full of bullfrogs and you let a bunch of Head Started turtles go there, sure, they'll grow to adulthood, but the second they start reproducing, all the hatchlings are going to be eaten. So, what have you really done? You just added a few turtles to a pond. And that's a valid point. So, you really should, for Head Starting programs, should be more inclusive than that or more encompassing than that and try to address the problems at that site, wherever you're letting the turtles go, the Head Start turtles, and make for a better success rate. Because ultimately, the whole point is to get reproducing populations going.
One last sort of question. This is something that's kind of very speculative, but one of the aspects of urbanizations is you get animals chopped up or their ranges chopped up that it's hard for a pond turtle to cross an interstate. And so, just curious what your thoughts are on how urbanization might be affecting turtles in the really long term.
Yes, in the really long term. Well, I mean, first off, it's hard to say.
Yeah.
Because, we can't really predict where areas are going to be built up. You can probably predict that if there's an open space, you'll probably have a house on it given enough time, especially in Southern California. But in the long term, you would have to be pessimistic because there's, like you said, turtles don't do well crossing highways. You get something like the 405 in Southern California where there's, 8 lanes and a concrete barrier in between the lanes. There's not too many critters going to make it across that. And, they've even been shown to be very good for birds. Birds don't like to fly across these huge highways either, for the most part. So you can predict that it's going to be negative, but and that's why it's really important to do the kind of genetic studies we're doing now, is to get that kind of baseline information to know what's there before it's gone. Because when you do want to go and put something back, like reintroduction programs, you don't really know what was there before. But, we do know that, habitat fragmentation is detrimental, because it does isolate populations, leads to inbreeding in local populations that are separated from one another given enough time. But the flip side is it doesn't take a lot of immigration, that is movement of pond turtle from one population to another, like from a large healthy breeding population to a small fragmented population. It doesn't take much of that movement to kind of maintain that genetic integrity of those smaller fragmented populations. And so there's programs like, facilitated immigration, where, just a fancy way of saying you pick up a pond turtle from a big healthy population and you drop it off in a smaller fragmented one just to bring in new genetic material. You'd really hope to be able to manage populations such that you don't have to do that. That's sort of a last resort kind of thing.
If you're an average nature lover, listening to this, and you happen to live in the range of the pond turtle, are there things people can do to either help or be less harmful?
Absolutely. Especially people that have ponds or creeks run through their property. One of the things that's critical for pond turtles, or any organism, is breeding, is reproduction. And a lot of places, a good way to help is just have the turtles have access to, the pond turtles having access to sites to lay eggs. That's really important. Clearing brush from the hillsides and stuff, or wood pond turtle would lay their eggs, is a good thing. And even doing something as simple as like not leaving your dog and cat food outside, because that provides sustenance for raccoons and skunks and possums. And these are the sorts of things that prey on nests. They're nest predators. They'll sniff out a turtle egg or a turtle nest, dig up the egg and eat them. So something as simple as that would help. And also, if you get a pet turtle, don't let it go. Don't let it go out wild.
Exotic, invasive.
So we're back, and there's a few themes in here that actually ended up resonating to me about resonating. I thought, and now we'll try to get into these more general themes a little bit with the discussion of the reserve in Mexico City, and that in general, sort of with the need to manage it for exotic species. I cut out a little discussion, actually, now I think about it, about in Mexico City studying whether they can reintroduce a fox species, which has sort of has disappeared from the reserve, and so
the gray fox.
I think it was a gray fox species, and so just in terms of the space, that whenever you have a space in an urban setting, if you are trying to manage it for if you want native species to be there, you almost always have to manage it somehow. It's a weird way to say it. Like, it's hard to find the baseline.
You can't just be hands off in urban environments and expect these species to persist.
Right. Well said. And so that is true there. And also there's the question of individual species. We got into a little discussion about on the pond turtle side about how maybe you can do a lot with a little bit of moving individual animals around to try to improve the genetic diversity within isolated populations. And then on an individual species level, we have the axolotl, which is virtually extinct from its native habitat in Mexico City, and which at the reserve they're trying to take advantage of some old quarry pits to set up sort of a fresh a reserve breeding population to try to keep the species going and have it somewhere as a backup in case everything goes totally south on the ones that are still left in their original habitat, or if they Just might want to use them for reintroduction. So you were recently involved with a toad repopulation project. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so here in Philadelphia, in the area, we have 200 plus years of urbanization going on. And there are little pockets of green if you look on the maps. But it's really hard if you're a small animal that doesn't disperse well and to get into these habitats if there's not good corridors or if they've been extirpated or eradicated from certain habitats. So in working with a local nature center called Briarbush Nature Center in Abington Township, they have a pond and they have 12 acres of forest around it, but they didn't have any toads. And the naturalist there, Mark, said to me, we have all these invasive earthworms everywhere, and I was wondering, wouldn't it be cool to have a native species that ate this invasive species, and can we get toads in our pond, running around in our forest, eating these earthworms? And I said, well, I don't know if they're going to eat all the earthworms, but I bet you we can get toads in here. And so...
Toads, you're talking about American toads, which will breed in a puddle in the middle of a path.
They are generalists par excellence. Yeah. They really know how to get it on and reproduce, but they're really bad at finding habitats and getting to habitats that have miles and miles of roads, because they will get squashed on the roads. So we were fortunate enough to find a nearby population that's already being used for outreach and education at the Roxborough Reservoir, in conjunction with the Friends of the Roxborough Reservoir, the City of Philadelphia Parks and Rec Department?
Parks and Recreation, yep.
Parks and Recreation, as well as the Schuylkill Center. And they have been doing a really cool project helping toads cross from the Schuylkill Center forest area across the road to an old water storage reservoir,
yeah,
which is at the top of a hill. And the toads have to cross this road, and every spring they were getting mowed down by people driving all over them. And so they got permission from the town or from the city to shut down the road, and literally hundreds of people come out on these nights.
This is a picture of my daughter, not this year, but last year when we went out for it.
Mm-hmm. I could not believe how many people came out to these things. It is so awesome to see everybody out there trying to help toads cross the road.
Yeah, it's really heartwarming.
So, I mean, we're talking thousands of people. Like, I think 5,000 in 1 year was one of the estimates that they had.
I went out there maybe the first year.
The first year. I've been out there a few years since.
Yeah. I think they're in like their 6th year. Or they've been doing it for a while.
I often look at the houses across from the reservoir and dream. Because I work very close to the reservoir.
Yeah.
It's an interesting place. You don't see ponds on tops of hills very often. It's all surrounded by towers and things, radio towers and cell towers.
It's, I think, the second highest point in Philadelphia. So that's where the
what's the highest?
No, maybe the third. I think Chestnut Hill's at the top. For some reason, they don't have towers on it. And then there's Roxborough, and then there's also right at Hawk Hill, I guess, or St. Joe's, and like where all the radio stations are. So like where all the TV stations are on City Avenue, and then across the Schuylkill, more like is at the top of that hill is Roxborough, where all the radio towers are.
And so, how do you have an indication of how the toads are doing? Because they would have hatched out and metamorphed it.
Well, so the project that we did, we got them as newly hatched tadpoles out of the reservoir, and I brought them back to my lab at Arcadia, and one of my students, Sarah, is doing her thesis on raising these and introducing them to Briarbush. And what we wanted to know was, how does the larval or tadpole environment that they're raised up under affect their ability to colonize a new area, and how does it affect their survival? So what I did was I drove around to every pet store in the Philadelphia area and bought all the 10-gallon aquariums I could find. I had 56 10-gallon aquaria in my lab.
Each with filters and stuff?
Every one of them. And we raised tadpoles.
What'd you feed them?
We fed them rabbit chow.
We had a couple that we had a few that died on us. We were trying to raise them up this spring.
Yeah.
I don't know
We
why.
got some nice rabbit chow with, I think, Timothy and things like that. But it's common to raise these things in the lab under that.
So what we used for trapping mosquitoes and West Nile virus is rabbit chow. Seems to be ubiquitous.
Yeah. It's cheap and they like it. So in some of the tanks, we had 10 tadpoles in a 10-gallon aquarium. In some of the tanks, we had 20 tadpoles, and in some of the tanks, we had 40 tadpoles.
Just studying densities effects?
Yeah, and so it's competition and density. And generally what you find is that if you are raised under more competitive environments with more tadpoles in the same tank, you may metamorphose later and at smaller body size, because you have to fight for more resources and there's more competition. So they're generally negative effects. Now, it's not universal, but that's the common theme. And then we've released over 800 toads to Briarbush, newly metamorphosed. And we're marking them with the most common way of marking amphibians, which is toe clipping.
Okay.
And when the animals are newly metamorphosed, they're tiny. I mean, a metamorphosing toad is about the size of a raisin. We anesthetize them on ice. We just chill them down. Then they don't feel any pain with a very sharp little, actually a toenail clipper. We clip off 2 toes on the front hand next to each other at the base, and what grows back is one big wide toe. And so depending on which toes we clip on which hands, we now know what the larval environment that toad experienced was. So we can find an adult toad for the rest of its life and know, oh, you had 9 competitors, or you had 39 competitors when you were growing up. And now
So
we're releasing the same numbers of the different densities, and we are tracking them. Every week we go out and sample them, and we hope to establish a population, and eventually they'll be reproducing in the pond, hopefully. But in the meantime, we can study the effects of the early life history to see, well, does it have a detrimental long-term effect to be grown under high density, or does it wash out, or how does that play out in the wild? And this is something that hasn't been done before. And we just had the opportunity to ask.
All from this guy saying, "Hey, we don't have any toads."
Yeah, I'm a new professor at Arcadia. I like doing work with local people.
Yeah,
Briarbush is right down the street from us, and I just wanted to, I wanted to do what they wanted to do. Right? We have different ideas, and this was just one that we both agreed on. Real quick would be fun and cool.
Notice that they had to go into the city to get toads to bring to the suburbs.
We wanted the closest population and the biggest population.
That's right.
Because we didn't want to have a negative effect on any on the source population.
Everybody's toads from one spot. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And we wanted to introduce a toad that would be closely related genetically and have experienced similar types of environments. And so it's about 6 miles away. So it's far for a little toad to walk, but it's close.
In the grand scheme of
terms.
toaddom, it's pretty close.
It's kind of interesting pointing out that the nearest habitat with robust toad population is in a city. We always joke that our definition of city versus suburbs is, like the suburbs of Philly would
We're
be
snobs about
the suburbs of Philadelphia would be city type habitat, and the rest of America, the majority of American cities. Abington Township looks like Milwaukee or like Los Angeles or something in terms of like housing density, but Philly just extra does. But you had this intentional preservation of open space in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Because it's so old, and people, William Penn and whatever, and then the War Department preserving the land because of William Penn wanted, who founded the city in 1682, wanted to be a green country town, and so and the War Department had the foresight to purchase all the land that they could along our water courses to prevent industrialization from polluting the water, and then when the sprawl happened, post World War I and then again post World War II, they didn't have the same kind of mentality. So even though you
can have a harder time finding green space in the immediate suburbs than you can in Philadelphia.
Right, they might have Norway maples and like lawns, but they're not actually good habitat for dozens of miles surrounding Philadelphia.
Part of what I like about, one of the things that turns me on in an urban nature kind of way about the Roxborough toad population is it's an example of toads or wildlife using what I think of as old industrial space. So we've got a similar story, actually, probably in the preceding episode when we post them, in our discussion with Keith Russell from the Audubon, and about their work to establishing a nature center in North Philly at the East Park Reservoir. It's another case of sort of an old, unused basin of a reservoir, which is it's a very industrial thing. It's built, it's got, these have brick facing, concrete roads around them.
They dug it with steam shovels and by hand.
Right.
And lined it with bricks 120 years ago.
Yeah. And so these are
no joke. It's like it's at least a couple acres.
And so
when you said old industrial, I was thinking like a club where everybody's wearing trench coats and like listen to Skinny Puppy. Oh, sorry, I just
so I like how in both cases, in both cases actually probably only took like 60 years or so for trees to grow in and like vegetation to grow in and for the basins to fill up enough that you have I don't know if you have fish. I think you got fish at the East Park Reservoir.
Fish. Rogue fishermen introduced them.
Yeah, there you go. So you probably fish in both. You certainly have toads which hopped their way in probably to both. You have waterfowl. I don't know if waterfowl's been looked at in Roxborough Reservoir. Is it too shallow? But
I'm not sure. I need to get in there.
Park, I remember
there's definitely geese and ducks, and there's stuff that flies in the evenings. Probably a lot of starlings and that sort of thing, but by the thousands. And we also saw a snapping turtle up there.
He's nodding at me right now. So that means, snapping turtles will get around. They'll walk. Sorry, I'm killing a grease ant that's made its way.
I guess it's not impossible for one that walked up all the way from the Schuylkill. Or...
They wander. People will talk about, sometimes it's a female laying eggs, sometimes they're just like, they go for hikes.
They go walkabout. I found them in the middle of woods, like a mile from the nearest water.
They just sort of, hey, I'll go see if there's a stream over there.
Yeah, and to get into Roxborough, they got to get under chain link fences and scoot down, 45-degree angle, brick lined.
Yeah.
It's like a slide.
And so that they get in there, and in Roxborough, in East Park, I remember Keith commenting about hearing toads calling in the spring. So I think they got American toads in the East Park Reservoir also.
Oh, they definitely do.
So it's a neat, in both of them, we have stories of sort of wildlife reclaiming old industrial space in cities. And we've got sort of like a discussion of the need to manage these things.
Maybe the aliens that just beamed us that that signal. Maybe we go to their planet and because they're supposedly, if the signal's strong enough to get here from that planet, then they're supposed to be type 2 civilizations, which means they like harness all the power of the sun, which means that they've been existing for millions of years. So we can go there and see what wildlife lives in their sewers.
It's only 30 million light years away.
Mm-hmm.
So we've.
So if they're listening,
hey guys,
we want to check out your herps.
Exactly.
They probably don't have herps. They probably have something else though.
We don't know, but we want to see it.
We already, even though your biota is going to be completely new to us, we already want to know your urban wildlife.
There you go.
Specifically.
So on that note, thank you for listening. Please tell everyone about the podcast. Please like us on your podcasting platform of choice. Please communicate with us. Let us know what you think, or tell us about great ideas, or record some
wildlife
and send it to us. You can tweet at us at UrbWildlifeCast. You can email us at urbanwildlifecast@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook. Get in touch. And until next episode, thank you very much. Thank you to Tobias for joining us.
Thank you guys. It's fun.
And we'll talk to you soon.
Cheers.
All right. And we're done.
So, hi, my name is Ailita Guy. I'm a PhD student at the University of Toronto studying urban bat populations as part of my thesis. Now, for the last 3 months, I've been working with a team of 5 people to capture and radio track big brown bats in one of Toronto's largest urban parks, High Park. In fact, I'm currently in the field at the moment with one of my assistants, Josh, trying to catch some bats. Now, one of the pieces of equipment we have with us is this really awesome acoustic detector. It's used by bat scientists and enthusiasts alike to help them hear the ultrasonic echolocation calls of bats. In fact, you can hear mine right now. And as you can hear for yourself, we aren't picking anything up, which means there probably aren't any bats around. Also means we probably won't catch anything tonight. But that's okay, because it's been a really great summer. We've caught over 200 bats of 4 different species. We've also collected really great radio tracking data on where bats are feeding at night and roosting or sleeping during the day. Now, together, this data is going to help us to understand how big brown bats use space in urban environments and how this may differ from how they use space in their natural habitats.
We have what we call the ELT principle, that everyone loves turtles.